Hello, this is Cryptolyze. I hope you are well on this Tuesday, 24 October 2023. In any case, personally, I'm doing really well when we see such a green, beautiful market with a BTC that is close to 35,000. We ask ourselves the question of whether we are bull running or not, and that is the subject of this video. As a reminder, you always have the possibility of having free access to the educational course, which is a 60-hour training course worth 400 euros, which allows you to learn blockchain, crypto, investment, technical analysis, trading, everything to become profitable. Through 130 videos, 400 pages of guides, quizzes to find out where you are in your progress, and all for free. To have access to this lifelong training, simply use the platform of one of our partners. Everything is explained in the comments and descriptions. We're going to start right away with the news, which explains a lot about the movement we had last night. We'll explain all of this a little. So already there was an indication through a tweet on which iShare, therefore which is BlackRock, has deposited in DTCC, therefore which is the deposit part which allows to be the tickers to make the ETFs. So when we look for an ETF, we look for its ticker, which is generally its representation code. But it was deposited in the institution which manages this part. So we have IBTC, which will be I for iShare, BTC for BTC, the BTC Spot ETF. That's very good news. It's something that shows that BlackRock is moving towards acceptance. We know that there have been discussions for some time. Personally, I'm not someone who thinks that this will be validated in 2024. But once again, it's good to be wrong when it's in the green. Afterwards, once again, we are far from acceptance. It is not yet done. It is an important phase. It means that in fact the negotiations are progressing in the right direction, especially since we also learns later. So on top of that, yet another thing has just been added. We have a member of the SEC, Esther Pierce, who is rather pro-crypto. We are not going to hide it. I mean, she has already made allegations which are really pro-crypto, who explains that she does not understand how come we haven't validated two spot BTC ETFs in the last 5 years, because in fact it's important, and it should have already been the case. We also learn, once again, that BlackRock is really moving towards a form of acceptance because it is not just the DTCC, therefore the deposit of the ticker which is done, but it is only, they announced, at least internally, that they are going to start doing pre-funding. What does it mean? This means that they will start to partially finance the ETF. So we will say that it is a spot ETF. I remind you that the ETF is a structured financial product which allows exposure to an asset or a series of assets. And to be in the spotlight, this implies that these assets must be held by the guarantor, implied in our case, BlackRock. So BlackRock must own BTC. So on that note, don't think that it's going to be bought at the market. Take a step back from that, because the volume that they have to buy at a given moment, it won't be at the market. It will be in OTC, over the counter, and there are several ways to get it. On this, I am sure that they are arranged with Coinbase and various other players, and that it is already being negotiated with a price which will not be the market price that we know there, okay? It's obvious, and we will have a price that will be priced in a certain way. So we have a certain amount of good news coming. Is it already purchased or not? Unfortunately, we don't know, we won't know, and I think we will know much later. And it is even likely that it has already been purchased this way. In any case, what is important to see is that it is certain that we are moving towards a notion of imminent approval, something that will happen very quickly. Whether it will happen at the end of the year 2023 or the beginning of 2024, we cannot say. But in any case, it is a good sign, especially since we have here the court which is asking the SEC to verify precisely the application of ETF grayscale. And that is it. In fact, it is the conclusion of the trial which is given in the form of obligation to the SEC, which is rather positive. And so there we still have an SEC which is under pressure. I remind you that she withdrew from the XRP lawsuit. She lost the grayscale lawsuit, and there are currently a set of requests from ETF Spot which are relatively pressing, with people who have political weight, which is very important. So we're going to take a quick break to look at the macro because today we have the GDP. So October services, which will be important. Then tomorrow we will have Powell. And Thursday we will obviously have the quarterly GDP, which will be very important. So why am I talking about the macro? Because it still has a very strong game for several reasons. We must understand when we look a little at the level of the relationship with BTC, we have had very strong acceleration movements in moments of contraction in the American economy. This was the case when we had the banking crisis with SVB, for example, where it was really a representation of an American economic crisis of the American banking system, in which we had a valuation of BTC following a crash of BTC. So we have these events which are endogenous, in which we have a form of pure decorrelation of the American economy, and in which we have a BTC which is growing. And to know that here we are heading towards news which is not necessarily positive, because we are not going to hide the fact that at the level of the SP 500, we had a fuse in which we liquidated absolutely everything. Even if we swallowed part, we still closed below. So we are in a bearish continuity. We have a VIX, which is the S&P 500 options index, which makes it possible to determine the expected volatility of the market in relation to the S&P 500, which is increasing. So overall, we are still waiting for a retracement of 5%. So we have an American economy which is sinking. Despite the fact that we have a NASDAQ that is holding up, technology stocks managed to maintain the S&P 500. So if we did not have the NASDAQ, the S&P 500 would already be much lower. And so, here we are asking ourselves the question, is the American economy not going to enter this recession that we have been waiting for some time, that we have already been forecasting for some time? Time? I invite you to watch the video I made on Saturday, which explains this part to you a little. But therefore, we ask ourselves the question, would at that time BTC not play a role in which we have liquidity transfers? On this, I will answer you straight away. For me, this is not the case. BTC is experiencing a magnet which is specific to it, to its life, which is an endogenous magnet, which is the validation of crypto ETFs. We're going to discuss that a little later. And so for me, the transfer of liquidity doesn't take place. And it's super important to see that it's the same principle as when we experienced FTX. It was a moment which was endogenous when we had a pure acceleration of the NASDAQ. It was during these periods reminds you that we were in this zone. Then we had all the very strong upward acceleration, and in which the BTC experienced this acceleration very little. We had a little bit of acceleration, but it was very weak. And precisely, the endogenous elements are not only linked to the decline, they are elements of decorrelation. And this is exactly what we are currently seeing, and what is positive. What is also positive about the macroeconomy is the fact that we have here the beginning of validation of protests. I told you that the closure was perhaps a little too light, and that we will have to wait for this weekly closing. So we are going to wait until the end of the week to determine whether or not we are in a breathing space in terms of oil, which would be rather positive. It would also imply that we have a pricing which is being done on a conflict in the Middle East, which should settle down, not necessarily remaining in the long term. Once again, we are waiting for the weekly close to validate that, and we have a DXY. So the representation of the dollar in relation to a basket of currencies, we see that this upward acceleration that we are in the process of retesting what we are in the process of retesting here, this top at 105. And there we will have to either hold, in which then we will start to rise again. And so there we have an upward pressure which will be very strong, because when we have the dollar, which is growing, we have the other assets which are under pressure. And if on the other hand we break the 105, that means that we will go and retest the 104 to then break. And there we will break relatively low, 102. Okay. And so there we will have a phase which will be rather interesting for everything which is active in general, everything which is Forex, which will be against the dollar, where we will have advantages which will be. On the other hand, we will try to answer the following question. Are the endogenous elements of BTC, compared to a macro that we currently have, sufficient to take us into a bull run? I will give you my personal opinion. Already, what is obvious is that we are seeing a colossal outperformance of BTC compared to the SP 500. The higher we go, the more significant we have a valuation of BTC compared to the S&P 500. So this implies that BTC outperforms the S&P 500, and we see that we are in the second consecutive week, and that we are heading slowly towards the $9, which corresponds to an important resistance zone. On this, if we perform it, on the other hand, we will go very high. We will immediately go for the $14. And so there, it would be positive in two senses. That means that we could have a BTC which remains in these levels of 36,000, 35, 34, 35, 36, and an SP 500, which sinks and continues to actually have a green candle in this index there. So it's positive. It means that we have this element of outperformance that we expect at the level of BTC, because the endogenous elements of BTC are in the process of being activated. And the question that we will have to address to pose are these elements which are clean to crypto, specific to BTC. Do we have an influx of liquidity? Important, because this is generally what we expect, is that we are in a form of buy the rumor, sell the news, implying an extreme valuation linked to perpetual, in which we do not have of inflows, therefore, of adding liquidity in the markets to hold precisely this upward acceleration. This is a bit the question that we are going to ask ourselves. First of all, we are going to look at it is indeed a pure BTC movement. We can clearly see 54%. I told you that if we made a break here, we were going to accelerate. That is indeed the case. Here we are technically moving towards the 58% quietly to go and retest this important zone here. So here I think that there is nothing stopping us in terms of BTC. In any case, the dominance of BTC. Dominance, I remind you, is the share of BTC in relation to all cryptos. Obviously, it can increase in two ways. Either a BTC which remains, finally which stagnates, and in which we have the other cryptos which are sinking, or a BTC which grows, and the other cryptos which do not move. There you go. Schematize. But it's a little bit the idea of dominance, and there it's really symptomatic of a movement which is specific to BTC, which is linked mainly to the news that we have, which is news which are specific to BTC with the BTC spot ETF. What is interesting to see is that we arrived right in the sell reloading TP zone, which is what I have been presenting to you for a very long time, with the CME gap which is present there. What's also really important is that when we look, we really stopped here at the gap. We really closed the gap at 35,000. So there we can close it. It is a gap that is closed. And there, the question we will have to ask ourselves is, are we really in this take-profit phase? Reloading sell? Personally, I admit to you that I shorted the 35,000 precisely for the closing of the gap, because it was an objective which was important, as I told you here, that I announced to you almost 4 months, 5 months. That was my zone in which certainly I was going to start a short, in which here I started to break even for the moment. I think there's a good chance that we'll retype 35.0, and I'll explain why. Because already at first we had a break which is very important, in which here I told you that we were in a range as long as we did not break the tops. Okay, here we have a break of tidy. Here we clearly have a range break in which there are two possibilities that can happen. First, we have an acceptance above this range, so we're going to wait to have a pullback at some point, whether it's a pure pullback on the 31,000, 32,000, or a small. A little less aggressive, and then a new acceptance with behind a break of structure, therefore a break once again of the 35,000 to validate an upward acceleration. On that, certainly on tomorrow's daily, we will talk about potential targets if ever we are in this scenario, but still a little early. Or we find ourselves here in the real principle of buy the rumor, sell the news, implying a valuation of a potential fact. Because this is the case, we are in the process of pricing something that is not yet effective, which is the spot ETF. It's not nothing. It's not people who are buying. And that's simply visible when you look at a small little on-chain inflows and deposits that are taking place. We can clearly see that we have no deposits in the exchanges in recent days. We have even been in a short decline since July, August, September, October, so there is no increase in deposits. We see that in the inflows, that is to say in the addition of pure liquidity that we find at the level of exchanges, we have nothing. We do not have an injection which takes place despite the acceleration also that we are seeing. And on the other hand, what we are also seeing is that in the other flows, therefore the outflow of money, we are rather stable too. So in fact we are in something that is stable. We are not in periods like we may have experienced in moments. We will just go backwards. A little more to see clearly, in these acceleration phases we really had inflows which were really important, which are bull run phases in which we have the injection of strong liquidity which arrives from outside on the market crypto. Currently, this is not the case. We are on a liquidity injection which is flat, identical to what we have experienced over the last 3 months, so that implies that this is not what is carrying the acceleration too. And even to go even further, this can be seen very clearly on the Kingfisher in which we have the even CVD which is pushing, the spot CVD which is still below, which follows the approach but which is still slightly below. We see, and the same, we continue the analysis. We will look a little bit at the movements. Did we have any liquidation? We see that we have had 216 million liquidations over the last 24 hours. With 80%, we schematize a little 75 minus 80% of shorts currently. With moreover, we will note the Bitfinex in which we had 99% short. So here on the other hand, Bitfinex is full short. But as a result, we still had BitMEX also I hadn't seen, 99.9% short. So we still have a lot of movements linked to liquidity and liquidation. Is this visible on the order flow? We look here at our open interest. What do we see? We see huge candles, so that means that we have a break. We went from 97 to overall 83, so we lost 15K of open interest, so that means that we liquidated a lot of shorts, and we see that where are the shorts? These are the hedging shorts that we found here on the top traders. This is not buying, this is not buying, this is the establishment of positions. So that implies that the positions which were short, which in fact maintained a form of hedging, were completely destroyed. And we can clearly see that the impact was relatively strong because the position, which is at 53%, we find ourselves in a position at 61, 62%. and therefore this clearly implies that hedging worked well in terms of the positions of the top traders, and therefore this is exactly what accelerated the bullish movement, namely that, as I had already told you for some time, is that here we are back there, we were in a top of the range. When we are in a top of the range, generally we do not buy not. That implies that we are going to place ourselves in shorts, and therefore that means that we have touched this area there. There are a lot of short positions that have been put in place. Likewise, on a bearish continuity to seek the top to sell, to buy back here in the 24,000, we had a lot of shorts, and therefore inevitably we had a bullish acceleration and a liquidation of these shorts, which is rather positive for the market. It means that we have achieved the big short squeeze that we have already been waiting for some time. I admit that he was very strong, very powerful, with a huge fuse. Is this the start of the bull run? For me, I don't think yet until I have validation and acceptance above the range. To have acceptance, as I told you, at some point you have to retest, structure, and start again with a new break of structure, in which there I will have the beginning of validation, and I will say to myself, okay, we can go higher, and therefore we will certainly project ourselves on tomorrow's daily life on important levels, in which we could find ourselves. But we must take into consideration two things, is that 1, we do not currently have acceptance. We could be in a classic form of distribution in BC, Arkansas, ST, SAO, Utah, UTAD, with a target which could fetch in the short term 36,000, 36,200, which would be the 1.618 of the extension of this acceleration on the retracement. And that, at a given moment, we are pricing something that is not yet present. Okay, we are pricing something that is not yet present, and which is really the classic characterization of, by the rumor, sell the news. So from the moment we have the news of the ETF, will we not have a retracement? And therefore is it that we will have a lot of breathing as a result? So we just have to be careful in relation to the control of its positions. I'm not saying that it's going to sink in, I'm just saying that you have to protect your positions, protect part of your gains if you're already making a profit. In this case, not necessarily in a spot, but when you're under a form of trading and when we are in spot, it implies that we have prepared all of that, and that throughout this part, we have been in a buying period. And therefore, in all cases, we will let it flow. Whether it accelerates upwards, whether it is the bull run, or whether it is in a form of acceleration and retracement, in fact, it has little impact when we are in the long term. Always think long term. Here, this upward acceleration, all in all, it's just a breather. It's nice to see green everywhere. But what we're waiting for isn't 35-0. What we're waiting for, it's a bull run. And a bull run is a series of candles like that over weeks and weeks, okay? This is the principle. This is what we see. Are we able to have it now in a tight macroeconomic level like we have, whereas we have not? Haven't had the halving yet. On a news story that hasn't been released yet, that's the question you need to ask yourself. Personally, I will not buy in this area, because I have already bought here, and I am already adequately exposed for this part. And if we ever go back there, I will expose myself again times. But personally, I'm happy with this news. I'm not overexcited because already when we look at Twitter, we see that it's full FOMO. Personally, that's always it. It's when I see that people are using false words, I always ask myself the question, is there a strong reason for this false word? Do I have liquidity? Do I have any substantial news? Do I have a pure fact behind it? And from there, I determine, does this change my vision or not? Personally, the breakdown of the range changes part of my vision. That means that potentially we could have an acceptance above. So that implies that we would start with a form of range that would be much bigger and much higher, and that we will certainly discuss tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, or even in Saturday's video, because we will have time to evaluate the closing of this week, and that will give us enough perspective on all that. But so there for me we have an element where we can ask questions about, okay, at this point, is the range up to 31,000 really our range? Isn't it 25 minus 35, which, as a reminder, is the range that I defined 6 months ago, where for me the gap had to jump at a given moment, and we have a resistance which is very strong, a resistance which is linked to what happened on Terra Luna, which is a very strong psychological resistance of the market. And therefore, obviously, we have here a resistance zone which will be very strong to break, and we will see, does not have a rejection which will be relatively strong. Do we not have here this UTAD which is present here? Or are we really in a form of acceptance? And that I think that we will have an answer in the coming days. And it will be very quickly, and it will be very interesting after this period of calm, of very low volatility. We have a return of volatility, and that gives us great pleasure. I hope that you liked this video. If so, don't forget to leave me a like and a comment. It always makes me very happy, and we meet at 13:30 to talk about XRP Ripple's crypto.